Thank you. For those of you not familiar with the language, emeritus in Latin means old fart. So let me begin. This is how we would like to imagine America responded to the Holocaust. This is, for all of you Marvel Comics geeks, this is one of the first Marvel comics. Joe Simon and Joe Kirby and Stan Lee worked on it. Captain America, March 1941. And you probably can't read it, but it says, smashing through, Captain America comes face to face with Hitler. And he socks him. And if you remember the first Captain America movie, actually, they played on that theme as well. What's unusual about this is that it's 7 months before the United States enters World War II. So it was actually fairly brave to do this cover. We weren't at war with Germany yet. This is another contemporary cartoon from 1939. This is about a ship I'm going to talk about, the St. Louis. And the St. Louis was a ship of 1,000 refugees, mostly Jews, who were able to get visas to Cuba that then were revoked when they landed. And so they had to be sent back to Europe, to Germany. And what happened was there was an intervention and they got sent to other places. But the United States did not allow them to enter, even though they were in Cuba. And they then steamed up the coast of Florida to see if the United States would admit them. And they weren't admitted. And so you've got the Statue of Liberty saying, keep out. Much of this story is very contemporary and relevant because much of it is about immigration. From 1933 to 1941, the goal of the Germans, at least certainly between 33 and 38, was not to kill Jews, but to take their money, their political rights, segregate them, but to encourage them to immigrate, even though it was difficult to immigrate because most of their money had been taken away, and it was the middle of the Depression, and no one wanted to take people who were impoverished in the middle of a time of high unemployment. But what affected how many people could be taken were immigration laws that existed before Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933 and Hitler became chancellor in 1933 in Germany. And so there's a whole racial basis to American immigration law. From the 1880s roughly to the 1920s, early 1920s, we had a relatively open immigration position. There were certain groups that were discriminated against, Japanese, as you probably know, some Chinese, but basically coming from Europe as whites was pretty easy because factories needed laborers. And between 1880 until 1920, there were some 20 million immigrants who came to the United States, mostly from southeastern Europe, either Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, or Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, some Turkey, not from Europe, but coming into the United States in huge numbers. Of that 20 million, 2 million were Jewish. Much larger than the Jewish population in the United States was less than 1% before this time. There were very, very few Jews in the United States before the 1880s. And here is this wave. And this wave coincides with the great wave of industrialization, urbanization, and all the problems that brings. Corruption, crime, whatever. And so before World War I, there were commissions that studied immigration to decide what should be done with all these people coming. And when you read these, they're called the Dillingham Commission reports. They're very racist. According at least to some racial theory, which became popular in the United States, popular enough, for example, to have its main advocate be a chaired professor at Harvard, what was happening was there were the Northwestern white European, usually Protestant populations, and they represented the Aryans or the Nordics. And then there were these inferior races coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe who were often swarthy. They were Catholic. There had been a lot of prejudice against Irish Catholics coming to the United States in the 1840s. They were Catholic, or they were Russian or Greek Orthodox, or they were Jewish. They were different. And what the Dillingham Commission did was to try to prove that higher crime rates and prostitution rates and slums and all those things were not just products of mass immigration of a country that didn't have enough resources to accommodate these people yet, but rather a product of the racial qualities that these new immigrant groups brought. And they tried to pass a law before World War I to restrict these groups. They failed, but after World War I, there was a reaction in the United States against being too involved in Europe. We didn't pass the Versailles Treaty or join the League of Nations. There was fear of communism and socialism and unions. All of these things were happening where there were large groups of immigrants, some from Russia. The Soviet Revolution occurs in 1917. So there's this fear that new people will come and will bring these foreign ideologies to American shores. There was the Red Scare of 1919. And then you have a move to pass immigration laws. The first laws that are passed in 1921, setting up quotas for who could come here. And you can see this, I'm just giving you the flow from 1907 to 1914, but you can see that under the Act of 1921, the numbers begin to reduce, and particularly they start to reduce for people coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, because the formula was we can take 3% of the numbers of immigrants that were already here from certain countries based on a 1910 census, and that turned out not to be enough. It only reduced the numbers by about 40,000. And so in 1924, they passed a much more comprehensive law, which pushed everything back to 1890 using those figures and only allowed 2%. And then you can see the enormous drop from 140,000 down to 21,000. I mean, it had been just 3 years earlier, 158,000. This disproportionately discriminated against where Jews lived. This is a map of the Jewish population of Europe before World War II. And if you can see, the largest center of Jewish life is Poland, 3 million. We think of the Holocaust as being about German Jews, but actually German Jews were a very small community, only 560,000. But you've got 3 million in Poland, 2.5 million in the Soviet Union. Romania had 900,000. This is where your big populations of Jews, these are the people who are going to need to be able to get out when Hitler comes to power. And not just when Hitler comes to power, but in the 30s, there's also anti-Semitic governments in Hungary, Poland, Romania, the big centers. And so these are people trying to get out, but they can't get out. And of course, the other big factor is the Depression. Once the Depression hits and the stock market collapse hits, that's 1929, 1930, you have high unemployment in the United States. And now you have a whole bunch of groups who don't want immigrants to come. American workers don't want immigrants because they're going to take your jobs. The way the law was written, it used to be that companies used to actually sponsor immigrants to come and work for them. So there's a provision in the law that says you can't come by being sponsored by a corporation. That ends up being interpreted by being sponsored also by a philanthropic relief agency. It's a corporation. You have to be able to prove that you have so much money that you won't become a public charge. And eventually they add that you have to be able to prove that you have a clean police record, something which became very difficult for Jews after 1933, coming from Germany, to go to the Nazi police and say, will you write what a wonderful person I am? All of these things become very difficult. But Jewish immigration, so when Roosevelt takes power, is elected in 1933, he has behind him labor, who want him to do work, work creation programs, to promote unions, make it easier for collective bargaining, things he does. He has liberals behind him. He has Southerners who hate the idea. Some of you may know this from your American history class. But the KKK had its big resurgence after World War I. And it didn't want to see any new immigrants coming. Very anti-Catholic as well as anti-Jewish as well as anti-black. So Roosevelt has Southern Democrats, though. We call them Dixiecrats. Basically, they want the economic benefits of the New Deal, but they don't want any liberalization of quotas. That's not something they'd accept. Then he has a whole nother group of people who support him who are from the West, who are isolationists. They don't want immigrants coming from China or Japan, but what they're also concerned about is that the United States doesn't get involved in another war. And many people thought if you bring in refugees, admit that people fleeing Germany, which is still not a belligerent country for us, you're implying that they're a belligerent country and that may bring us eventually to war. And so Roosevelt, in his first 3 years, 1933 to 1933, when German Jews could get out if someone would sponsor them, most of the world didn't because they were in the Depression too. They didn't want another war. There was anti-Semitism there in Europe and in the United States. And Roosevelt, coming with huge unemployment, decided he's going to focus on economics. He's not going to be a foreign policy president, to keep his coalition together. And so for his first 3 years, he basically does nothing. And under the way the quota system worked after the Depression started, this was started by Hoover, basically it reduced that number that I showed you down to 10% of the number from 1924. It made it very difficult for anyone to get in during the Depression. But this is where people went. These were German Jews, though, again, we mourn for the German Jews because they were the first victims of Hitler. They had 8 years. Immigration wasn't closed until 1941 for them. They had 8 years to get out if they could find a place, and the majority of them did get out. Unfortunately, most of them got out to France or Holland or Belgium, which would be occupied by the Germans again. But some got to England, and as you can see, about 90,000 got to the United States, largely on the German quota, because the quota for Germany, they were Northwestern Europeans, was fairly high. Even that quota wasn't filled initially, but I'm going to show you how this shifts. But basically, so you get a sense of why Roosevelt does what he does, you can see the unemployment rate when he takes power is almost 40%. Hard to imagine. He creates all these agencies to create work and regulates the banks more, but he oversteps his power. He tries to add members to the Supreme Court to support his policies, and the Supreme Court basically declares much of his legislation unconstitutional, but it does bring down unemployment by 1937. But you can see why he's preoccupied then with domestic politics, not with rescuing Jews. He also has to take into consideration with the Depression, you have a lot of unemployed people who either resent the wealthy or the bankers who they blame for the stock market crash, or who themselves are radicals, are laborers competing for jobs. And Roosevelt, because he was sympathetic to the Jews, he ran in 1928 as governor of New York and won with a lieutenant governor who was Jewish. The first time, he had a number of Jewish advisors. His Treasury Secretary was Morgenthau, was Jewish. And so there was this perception among anti-Semites, some of whom came off the KKK, many of whom were German Americans who supported what they called themselves originally the Friends of New Germany. They became the American Bund, and they supported what Hitler was doing. And then there were there was one that was very strong in San Diego, the Silver Shirts, that sort of saw America as a fascist dictatorship, which would get rid of the foreigners, the immigrants, the racial inferiors. That group was very strong in San Diego County. In fact, it tried to take over the naval base. And if any of you are interested, this is a great project. You can go to the San Diego Historical Museum, and they put out a newspaper called The Broom, because they were going to sweep San Diego of the foreigners. And I should mention Mexicans. And if you know the history of 1930s United States, though Roosevelt was supposedly a liberal guy, he authorized the deportation of about 400,000 Mexicans who were just sort of pushed across the border. But nonetheless, Roosevelt was perceived as Jewish. He wasn't, but his enemies called him Franklin Rosenfeld. And you can see this one where he's holding a menorah. These are just cartoons. Father Coughlin was a Catholic priest who started preaching that big businesses were all controlled by Jews. Communism was controlled by Jews. He had an audience. He was a radio preacher, had an audience of 30 million people, not insignificant. Does that cartoon look familiar to any of you, the style, by the way? Dr. Seuss, yeah, Dr. Seuss was a political cartoonist during this time. You're going to see a couple. This is an American Bund meeting with that great Aryan George Washington up there. And then Pele, this was the Silver Shirt newspaper that was put out nationally. So Roosevelt, in the second term, 37 on, Hitler at first was just rebuilding Germany, rearming Germany, getting Germany out of the Depression. By 1936, he had occupied the Rhineland. He was beginning to spread talk about annexing other parts of Europe. Roosevelt knew a lot about Germany. He had traveled there extensively. He knew German. He was worried about Hitler. And from 37 to roughly 41, I should say really 39, he wanted to do something for the Jews, but he felt he couldn't do anything because it would break up his political coalition, which consisted of people, liberals who didn't agree with the people from the South, who didn't agree with the people from the West. And this is a public opinion poll from July 1938. It's very typical of this period. How many people want to let Jews in? Roughly 18% of the population. 67% are against. And if you look at other public opinion polls about Jews specifically, next to blacks, which group would you least likely want in your neighborhood or to be friends with or whatever? Jews are up there at about 40%, 45% in American public opinion polls. So Roosevelt, in 1938, the crisis gets very bad because Hitler basically forces Austria to join Germany in what's called the Anschluss. And whereas he had employed this thing of taking away money and political rights to coerce Jews into fleeing, in Austria he tries a new approach, which is basically to do all these things all at once and encourage Jews to get out as quickly as they can. There's a refugee crisis. Roosevelt comes up with this idea, I'm going to try to persuade other countries to take Jews, and maybe we'll increase our quotas as well, and that way we can deal with this problem. But he goes to this conference in France, Evian, some of you drink the water. Evian spelled backwards is naive, by the way, and no country bites, actually one country bites, the Dominican Republic. Is willing to take Jews. The United States says, well, it'll expand its quota. Now that Austria's been taken over, it'll expand the German quota to include Austria and will start being less rigorous in employing these various regulations. And it does take quite a few Jews from 1938 to 1941 come to the United States. But for most Jews, there was no place to go. And just to show you the politics of this, we know this guy is Jewish. He's wearing a skull cap. This is what the conference was about. But he's not called a Jew. He's called a non-Aryan. So people didn't even want to use the term Jew in the debate. In November 1938, the beginnings of the Holocaust start to emerge with Kristallnacht. the mass looting and destruction of Jewish businesses, synagogues, shops, and the first mass arrest of Jews in Germany, some 30,000 Jewish men, who were, by the way, taken not to stay in concentration camps, but they hoped it would get the West to take them, to change their immigration policies. Roosevelt withdraws the American consulate. He condemns what happened, and he doubles his efforts to get countries, mostly in Latin America, to take Jews. And he was not unsuccessful. He got a lot of Jews into Cuba, about 5,000, Peru, Colombia, Chile, and Brazil. And that became important. In 1939, though, we have this incident that I started out with. And that's the incident of the USS St. Louis. The St. Louis is a German steamship. It's got 980 passengers. Only one is not Jewish. They're trying to get out. They all have purchased visas from what turned out to be a very corrupt immigration official in Cuba, who was in a power struggle with the president and the military strongman in Cuba, a man by the name of Batista, who's the person Fidel Castro overthrew in the 1950s. When they arrive in Cuba, they're told they can't disembark. 24 actually have legal papers. The rest have all their papers rescinded. So now they have to find a place, and as I mentioned, one possible place was the United States. There's a Jewish organization trying to negotiate with Cuba to find places. Cuba basically wants to extort money to allow these people to land. And it raises the rate too high, and the Jewish organizations didn't feel like they wanted to set the precedent of ransoming Jewish communities. And Roosevelt, because of that, he was looking at what the Jewish community did. Roosevelt decides he won't do anything. Now, any of you ever see the movie The Voyage of the Damned? No, there's a movie about this, but it's not a very accurate movie. The myth that's risen around this is that the ship it had a very friendly German captain who wanted to help his passengers, goes to Miami, and the Coast Guard comes out and signals him, go away or we'll have to shoot on you. And then he goes back to Europe. That's not what happened. Basically, Roosevelt never responded to the inquiries, but they allowed the Coast Guard to monitor the ship, hoping that there would be some sort of breakthrough to allow these Jews to go somewhere. And it did occur. There were successful negotiations with France and Belgium and Britain and Holland to allow these Jews to go back. And they eventually went back to Europe and didn't have to go back to Germany, where they had disembarked. But of those Jews, those who got to England were safe, or to Switzerland, which also took in Jews. But those who went to France, Germany, and whatever, many of them ended up in concentration camps, about 500 of that number, and about half of them died. But the other thing that Roosevelt was contending with by this time was whether the United States should join the war, because in 1939, Germany invades Poland in September. Remember, 3 million Jews in Poland, the single largest Jewish population. And because the Congress didn't want to get involved in foreign affairs or in a foreign war, they had passed a number of neutrality acts in the 1930s not to allow arms and assistance to countries that were at war. Roosevelt was very sympathetic to the British. He realized that if the British collapsed, all of Europe would go Nazi. And he wanted to help the Germans, or to help the British, but he couldn't go to war because public opinion was so against it. And you can see this. This is from 1940. Should the United States declare war on Germany? Almost 80% as late as the end of 1940 say no. And actually, as late as the summer of 1941, it's about 70%. Don't want to go to war. Very few do, though there is sympathy for England. And so basically, that's what Roosevelt focuses on. Those who hate Roosevelt, who are very critical of his policies and say he betrayed the Jews, who had been his supporters, say, he did nothing during this period. We could have gotten people out. It was before everything closed down, before they stopped immigration from Germany, and when there still were possibilities to get Jews out, all of which is true. But his supporters say, well, if he didn't bolster Britain at this time, at a time when the United States didn't want to get involved in the war, everything would have been lost, including not just Britain, the Jews who had gotten to Britain, but Britain controlled the Mandate of Palestine, where a lot of Jews had gone in the 1930s as well. These are, again, come out of those debates. But basically, Roosevelt got what he wanted, which was called cash and carry. If the Brits could pay, and if they could provide the ships for equipment, they could go and buy from the United States. You see another Dr. Seuss cartoon there. But this is from the isolationist group, what were called the American Firsters. And it's interesting. Here's the anti-Semitism, but it's coded. 2/3 of our senators voted in favor of the bloodthirsty warmongers and money changers. Who are the money changers? Is it the banks? Or, when you hear that, I think, New Testament and Jesus tossing out the money changers out of the temple. Just another cartoon. Roosevelt increases the aid in 1941 by creating what's called Lend-Lease, which allows us to lend equipment and to lease equipment and to lease bases. And we also accompany many British ships so they won't be sunk by American submarines. And what happens then is American ships get sunk by German submarines. So we actually break off diplomatic relations with Germany in the fall of 1941. Roosevelt wants to get into the war, but he doesn't seem to, he doesn't have the political support yet to do so. Okay, now I have to shift over a little bit because the timing of the Holocaust becomes very important to this. From 1933 to 1941, remember, Jews could still get out of Western Europe. Eastern Europe was more difficult. There already were ghettos, but there was no concerted plan to kill Jews yet. There were Jews who were killed because of terrible conditions in the ghettos in Poland, but the final solution, the Holocaust as we know it, didn't exist as a policy. It developed sometime in 1941, most people think with the invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany had, its arch enemy was the Soviet Union, but Germany strikes a pact with the Soviet Union in 1939, basically to divide up Poland. Because that way Hitler doesn't have to worry about something that always plagued German leaders, namely a two-front war. It's one of the reasons why Germany lost in World War I, was it was fighting both in the East and the West. So Hitler wants to conquer the West, and then he'll turn towards the East and break his agreement. So when he invades the Soviet Union in 1941, in June, he sends what are called Einsatzgruppen. And Einsatzgruppen are killer squads. And basically what they go to, in each village, they'll say, we're out to get the communists, the Commissars, it's called the Commissar Order, Jews, and Gypsies. And they go to a village and they round them all up, they take them out to a ditch and they shoot them. And some 1.5 million people are killed in mass shootings, what some people have called the Holocaust by bullet in 1941. And so the stakes are up now. Getting people out is more important. And in late 1941, this was only on the Eastern Front, but depending on who you believe and how the Holocaust evolves, for a number of reasons. One is Hitler was doing so well and it was so easy to kill Jews under the cover of war in 1941. In the flush of victory, he decides, we can kill them all. That's one explanation. Second explanation is the war isn't going so well by October. He's got a long Soviet winter. Supplies, German troops are all over the place. Are we going to have enough food to feed these people? that are under our control. Instead, let's starve them or kill them en masse. One of those two scenarios played out. And by December of 1941, you have a plan where there are camps that are created whose only purpose is to kill people. Initially not with cyanide gas, but with carbon monoxide that's from engines, car engines, and truck engines. And you have the beginning of mass killing and the deporting of Jews from all over Europe, but the majority are in Eastern Europe. That's why the death camps are in Poland. That's where the most Jews are. It's not that the Poles are anti-Semites. The Poles don't create, Poland has a strong anti-Semitic movement, but it had no plan to kill all the Jews. Hitler came up with that. And you're deporting people from France and from Holland and even from Italy. And the major deportations occur when Germany is doing the best in the war, which is 1942. It's been winning. It wins in Western Europe. It looks like it's going to win for a while in North Africa and be able then to go on to Turkey and also go into Palestine. And in August 11th, 1942, this is all happening on the war front. It's supposed to be secret, but you've got hundreds of thousands of soldiers, German soldiers, who are seeing this happening. And information starts to leak out, and we now know it was a German businessman by the name of Edwin Schulte who was ashamed at what was happening. He did business with Switzerland. Switzerland had the headquarters of what's called the World Jewish Congress, and so he met with the leader in August of 1942, and basically they know, this is a confidential telegram, that the Nazis are exterminating the Jews. And they even know, they said method of execution undecided, but prussic acid, which is cyanide, has been considered. And it was being considered for certain camps. Other camps retain the carbon monoxide system. But if you know anything about carbon monoxide, and I hope you don't, but if you ever had a friend who attempted suicide or knows, it takes a while. It's a slow process. And whereas cyanide is quick. And so that was the debate. The debate was not whether you should kill people. The debate was how you should kill people that was going on. And by December of 1942, basically the United States government confirms these stories. But I should tell you here, Roosevelt now had another consideration once the war broke out and we're allied with both the Russians and the British. One is the war. That's his main focus. We got to win the war as fast as possible. So when people asked Roosevelt, how are you going to rescue Jews? He said, win the war as fast as possible. That's the best way to rescue Jews. Other people said, well, why don't you pressure other countries to take in Jews that are nearer? The most obvious country was England, because there was a Jewish community in Palestine that was trying to create a state that the British said they would allow them to eventually create. And what happens is the State Department intervenes and says, no, we don't want, Britain's our most important ally. We can't put pressure on the British. It will embarrass them. The British say they don't want to take in any extra people. For our wartime diplomacy and military policies, we can't put any pressure. And so what the State Department did is when it started getting the information that the Holocaust was occurring, it basically buried these things. It said, well, it's a private source, or it's a Jewish source. It must be biased. And it took them some 5 months before they confirmed the reports. But they did confirm them in December 1942, and the United States then, along with the British and the Russians, said, well, you can see in the red, German authorities are now carrying into effect Hitler's oft-repeated intention to exterminate the Jewish people. And it then says later on in here, we will hold these people hold these people responsible for crimes after the war. That's the beginning of the Nuremberg trials. The origins are there. There's going to be some sort of international tribunal against the Germans. But the State Department, and again, just to give you a sense of what could be done, 1933 to 1940, when you could get Jews out, there aren't that many Jews being killed. Most of those are in Poland. are killed by starvation and initial policies of violence when they go in. 1941, you have that 1.5 million, and then 2.7 million. 1942, the war is going well. The Germans are at the height of their power, and they're deporting people left and right. What can the United States do? And then it goes down because there's fewer Jews left, and it's, whereas deporting a Jew from Warsaw to Belzec or Treblinka, which were the camps where they usually went, or to Auschwitz, which are in Poland, that's not that difficult. But to deport Jews from Holland or from France is a couple of days' trip. It's a much more difficult process. Plus, Jews had been fairly well accepted as equal citizens in the West. They hadn't been in Eastern Europe. And so it was a much trickier process in the West. And so you have fewer people being deported, and they're coming for longer ways. And the other thing, which is part of this, I've already mentioned, is England had committed itself after World War I to carving out a piece of Palestine, which would be a national homeland for the Jews, a refuge. It didn't say a state, but a kind of refuge. And it had encouraged immigration there in the 1920s, but that had created an Arab backlash. And in the 1930s, the British tried to balance the interests of the Arabs, which was very important to them because most of the British Empire, a large percentage of the British Empire, was Muslim. They controlled a lot of countries in northern Africa. They controlled a lot of, like Egypt. They controlled countries as far as India. India had a large Muslim population. Many of the soldiers fighting in the British Army were colonial troops who were Muslims. So if you wanted to fight the war, maybe it isn't such a good idea to be sponsoring a Jewish state. And from 1936 on, the Arabs were in open revolt against the British. The British didn't want to leave lots of troops in Palestine. So in 1939, they created a white paper, which basically said, there's not going to be a Jewish state. We're going to allow 75,000 more Jews to come over the next 5 years. And then we'll let the people vote. And that would have meant Jews would be maybe about 35 to 40% of the population. Arabs would be 60%. There would be no Jewish state. And the British blockaded it. They made it very difficult for Jews to get into Palestine. Again, the question is, could the Americans sway them to take more Jews by supporting Palestine? Roosevelt, earlier in his career, had supported the idea of the Jewish state, and he would come back to this. But the question during this period, also in the State Department, is if we admit refugees coming from Germany or Eastern Europe, how do we know they're not spies? How do we know they're not plants who are trying to undermine us? Maybe they're communists. The people in the State Department were not necessarily on the same page as Roosevelt, who had good relations with Jews. They tended to be Eastern Christian liberals, not liberals, career states, career diplomats. And the person who ran the Department of Naturalization and Immigration was a man by the name of Breckinridge Long, who basically opposed any rescue efforts because it would put undue pressure on our allies and would undo the immigration quota system and would be a security risk. This is a secret memo of his from 1940. We can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants who enter the United States. We do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way and to require additional evidence and to resort to various administrative devices which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas. So he left it up to the consuls, and there were certain consuls who were sympathetic to the Jews who allowed Jews in. For example, the Panama Zone. About 5,000 Jews were, but most consuls followed his orders, so you couldn't get Jews in that way. One other thing that happened during this period was when Germany starts losing the war, which usually we attribute to its defeat in North Africa at El Alamein, in late 1942, and its defeat on the Russian front at Stalingrad, late 1942, early 1943. Many of the countries that had allied themselves with Germany and had cooperated with deporting Jews, they did so to gain territory that Germany gave them, aid. They decided they were on the losing side. And they started to try to negotiate to improve their image when the Allies won. And one of the ways to do this was to let Jews out and to benefit, basically to ransom Jews out. The Treasury Department managed these negotiations to allow a lot of money to be deposited into Swiss blocked accounts, which wouldn't be allowed to be used for anything else except for Jewish relief. The State Department argued that no, this money would be used by our enemies. And though Roosevelt authorized his Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau, to conduct negotiations, actually had arranged for about 100,000 Jews to get out of Romania and out of France and be put under American protection, the State Department basically sabotaged this. They wouldn't approve it. And there started to develop a growth of people within the Congress who said, we have to do something. There has to be some sort of Jewish relief plan. Because now we have this news of what's coming. I mean, we know they're being exterminated. We have to help. And Roosevelt was a very cautious politician. He didn't want to deal with what he saw as a political backlash until the people in the Treasury Department wrote up a report on how all the rescue attempts had been blocked by the State Department. And this is the report. They eventually changed the title. The original report given in January 1944, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of the Government in the Murder of the Jews. And it's all about how the State Department has deliberately suppressed information, sabotaged rescue plans, and has lied. They brought this guy Breckinridge Long to a congressional hearing where I said, how many people have you brought in? And he gave this huge number. And it turned out, it was about 20% of the number he gave. He lied. He was eventually relieved of his duties. And so in January 1944, Roosevelt finally created a relief agency specifically charged with rescuing Jews or protecting Jews, but not with Jews. Again, it had to be equal opportunity. Any victims, any refugees, displaced persons. Now, the problem with this was it was underfunded. Most of the funding came from private organizations, relief organizations, Catholic Church, some Protestant organizations, Jewish organizations. What was left of what was called the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. So it didn't have a lot of money, and it didn't have a very high profile. But it was able in these months from January of 1944 to April and May of 1945, when the war ended, to save 200,000 people without a lot of money. And it did this in two ways. One was the most spectacular, was in Hungary, where the Jews of Hungary, it had an anti-Semitic government, but it was a government that was interested in discriminating against Jews, not in liquidating them. And it was a place where Jews came for sanctuary, because even though you might be discriminated, you might be put in a labor battalion or something like that, you weren't going to be killed. So it had about 800,000 Jews. It was an ally of Germany's. It wasn't occupied. But then, as they saw Germany was losing the war, the government there decided to negotiate with the Allies to create a separate peace, and Germany occupied it. So now it had 800,000 Jews on its hands, and there was a group, Hungarian group of Nazis who were all too eager to engage in this. But there were lots of foreign observers that knew what was going on. And so basically what happened is the various consuls there set up a situation where with funding from the United States, from the War Refugee Board, and from their own countries, they created what were called safe houses. They would rent apartment buildings and allow Jews to live in them, put their own flags above it. These were neutral countries. Germany needed their support still, and basically tell the Germans, these people are under our diplomatic protection. And the argument would be, they'd say, why? And they'd say, well, because they've got an uncle who lives in Sweden or an uncle who lives in Switzerland. And they would produce papers which were called protective passes. And they were able, depending on whose story you follow, to save roughly between 50,000 to 100,000 people just in this one exercise. This is where Raoul Wallenberg, who was the American, a Swedish diplomat who the Americans recruited to undertake this mission, was able to do that. The other thing that Roosevelt did is Roosevelt had this idea. There's a concept called the free port. And the free port is during a war, if you have a ship with cargo and a country has gone to war and you don't want to bring that cargo to that country, you can go to a neutral port and basically let the cargo stand there until the end of the war. And so Roosevelt came up with this idea with a journalist. We'll do the same with Jews. We'll treat them like stateless property, but we'll put them under our protection. And Roosevelt did this because he hoped other countries nearer the area would do this. But we had just taken over Italy. There were lots of refugees and displaced persons in Italy who were in the way of military operations. So Roosevelt authorized one haven, what was called an emergency refugee shelter, during the entire war. It was in upstate New York, in Oswego. This is called Fort Ontario. I've done research on it. And basically, it was an old Army base that was no longer being used. The community wanted people to be there because it was a source of employment. They were happy to let people come in, and about 1,000 people came in, but Roosevelt was very careful. Everyone had to sign a paper saying, after the end of the war, I'm going back to the country where I started. And they couldn't take any work because then they would be competing for American jobs, even though there were labor shortages in the area. In fact, those shortages were filled by German and Italian POWs who were also interned in camps in the area. Just to give you a sense of where it ranked, it was run by the same people who ran the Japanese internment camps, the War Relocation Authority. So they were treated, I mean, their treatment was not, it was certainly better than being Europe, and many of them, after a while, the rules on them loosened up. But Roosevelt would never allow them to immigrate to the United States. It was only Truman who allowed that in 1946. The one other controversial thing that Roosevelt is accused of not doing is we didn't know the details about Auschwitz, which was the single largest camp. It wasn't a camp that was just a death camp. It had one of its sub-camps was a death camp. It was an industrial center. It was also a place where political polls were kept. We were, after we took over Italy, and particularly after D-Day, we were able to bomb targets in Poland. And we were bombing targets in Poland in the vicinity of Auschwitz. So some Jewish leaders, not all, said, bomb the trains coming from Hungary carrying these Jews, and we'll stop what's going on that way by bombing the train tracks or bombing the camp. Other Jewish groups, I should say, came out and said, no, if we bomb those troops, we're going to kill lots of Jews. And the Germans are used to these bombings. They can fix the tracks quickly. And probably more importantly, if they don't have gas chambers, they still have guns. They killed, millions in a short period of time in 1941. Why couldn't they do it in 1944? But it turns out we actually were bombing Auschwitz. But we were bombing the factory that used slave labor from Auschwitz. And when people have looked at the aerial photographs since, they realize we were flying over Auschwitz almost on a daily basis. And what's interesting is, they looked only at the industrial targets. They never looked at the other footage. It's kind of like 9/11, you have all these warnings, but you don't put it all together until you know what happened. And so we now have discovered that we could have bombed Auschwitz, and Roosevelt, it's pretty unclear whether it ever came to his desk. The military didn't want it because they saw it as a diversion of military resources. They wanted to win the war as quickly as possible. and they just felt that it was a waste of weapons. But you can see the bombs falling here. They're going down here to Monowitz, but here's where the gas chambers are. And when you get these really blowing up, you can even see prisoners march. And I just gave you most of the reasons for why we did or didn't bomb. Finally, in 1945, we came upon the concentration camps. The Russians had known this earlier. Since the summer of 1944, they had liberated Majdanek, which was one of the early camps. And in January 1945, Auschwitz was liberated. And the United States came upon camps that weren't death camps. They were concentration camps. But many of the prisoners from Poland had been marched back brutally to the camps in the West. They were overcrowded. Lots of people were dying. And it shocked the United States. When Eisenhower saw it, he said, not only do I want all my soldiers to see what happened here, but I want the townspeople in the area to come and see what happened in their name. And the Nuremberg trials then followed. So what do we have? With this record, Roosevelt was not very good the first 3 years of his presidency. Pretty good the second 3 years when he was trying to get more German and Austrian Jews out and Jews into places in South America. Not so good after the war broke out, and then he has his fourth, what one writer calls his fourth presidency, where he is committed to rescuing Jews from 1944 on. It's a mixed record, but even with the mixed record, we took in more Jews during this time than any other country. We had more of a capacity. But Palestine took in 120,000. You might say, how did they get past the British? It was legal to immigrate there in the 30s, and so you got almost about 80,000 who came in the 30s. The British still allowed immigration until 39. And then the rest, much of the rest was illegal immigration by Zionist organizations. And then there's just some strange outliers. So you can see the South American countries, which Roosevelt persuaded to help. And then there's some strange things like, why did Japan take 2,000 people or Shanghai 25,000? And that has its own dynamic. Maybe I'll answer that in the question and answer period. Anyways, this is from John Paley, who ran the War Refugee Board. I had a chance to interview him. He said, we recognized when the board was established that there were limits to what we could do given the military situation. Looking back at the board, I recognized it was too late when it was established, and the resources available were too small to deal effectively with the problem. But we were able to change the policy of the United States, and we were able to help the private agencies, and we were able to change the moral position of the United States in this area.